explosion of fiscal discipline, the macroeconomics looks bad again.
Lots of things to say, so let me try to be brief. First, just very quickly, when the empirical work that I've done with Barry Bosworth, we, with a consistent data set and a consistent set of conditioning variables, we explored every variable that we could get consistently across all of our countries. And the things that we do not discuss are the ones that did not come in significantly. Financial depth was actually one of those. And so I think there's more debate about when and which of these other kinds of measures actually matter. But the main point I want to talk about, in part because they're endogenous and they're a variety of different, so this is actually more debate, I think, about some of those pieces in the literature than Massimo mentioned. So that's something we can talk about afterwards. But the main point I wanted to make is my read of a lot of this literature about crises and the differences in policy outcomes, I think one of the key lessons is exactly about fiscal policy. One of the most difficult things to do, but one of the things that differentiates the countries that are able to do well over long time periods and the ones that are not, is the ones that somehow get the fiscal house in order. I was sitting here yesterday listening to the papers and the discussion, thinking about the fact that we're talking about confidence and competence, but in practice when we elect our leaders, there are multiple issues that are on the table that voters are selecting for. And the idea, especially in charged small economies, that we are electing leaders who are particularly confident in both designing and implementing a fiscal retrenchment, that's not what people get elected for. But in fact, and then when they're in office, they may recognize that the good legacy policy would be to carry those things out, but that's not often what they were elected to do, and it's not necessarily what their expertise is in, and it's also not necessarily what the expertise in the ministries that they're leading have competence in. And so there's, I think, at least potentially a mismatch between the multiple issues and then the things that people get elected for and the things that it turns out matter for the longer term growth. And so I guess I would be very interested. I'm sure it's quite difficult to solve, but if you have 2 or 3 issues and you have different competence on different ones, I mean, those kinds of models suggest a different story. It's not that countries don't necessarily know, or there are multiple issues, and what the trade-offs are is complicated. And so people might be elected in a particular time period to carry out one set of issues, and they may have nothing to do with things like fiscal competence, which are really hard to get right, especially if you're starting in a scenario where you haven't had that history. So that's a much bigger topic, but I did want to at least raise those thoughts.
Thank you. I'd like to connect Colin Bullock's comments to the theme of this panel. Colin made the point about how important is the role of fiscal policy, and for some reason, fiscal policy in Jamaica went awry in the 1970s. Well, I think what's important to this discussion is what that reason is. Jamaica, at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, was a country that, as has been pointed out, had a successful and stable exchange rate peg, low fiscal deficits, and a record at that point of 20 years of an average growth rate of 6%. But at that point, a party got elected on a platform that we can do better than this, that better can come, and that this better must come was the campaign slogan, and that it argued persuasively that the lives of the majority of persons, the majority of the electorate, can be improved with distributional policies. And so he got elected, and therefore had to deliver on those policies. Now, the story is perhaps apocryphal, but it is told that when that political leader announced in Parliament and to the nation that he was instituting free education, the announcement was news to the Minister of Finance. So the incentives, that message resonated in Jamaica, despite what was then a sound policy framework and did not resonate in a country like Barbados. And that had to do, perhaps, with the extent of the income maldistribution, if you believe Engelman and Sokolov, which incentivizes different, non-productive policies. So I mean, Colin may be right, but it gets us back to what we are discussing here, which is the extent to which your institutional framework is an outcome, perhaps. The policies that come from institutional framework is an outcome of what the incentives are in your political system.
Just to comment on one point, to reinforce the point Damien and Colin made. Damien and I joined the Planning Institute at the same time. I had more here then. So we were very familiar with some of these things. And if you really looked, in the early 1970s, the average annual increase in wages between 1972 and 1976 was over 80% per annum. 80. 80. It was not unusual for people to get 130% increase. This was clearly not sustainable. There was no relation to productivity or anything. It was the beginning of the end, in a sense. The question about fiscal responsibility is so central, but it is reinforced by the fact that there's no coalition, there's no NGO, there's no political movement, there's no group in the society that argues for fiscal discipline. None whatsoever. Maybe one or two journalists or commentators, but no social group. It has to do with the issue of inequality, the initial condition, and the similarity of politics by the two major parties. The point you made about when the Prime Minister announced the free education, and the Minister of Finance didn't know, a moment that is recorded in the history of Jamaica. The opposition spokesman on education walked across the floor and shook the hand, which is quite unusual, congratulating the government. So there was a unity between the parties on this distribution issue. So for me, the central thing here that drove the fiscal indiscipline was the similarity of the political parties that both had very populist approaches to politics. Their support base was the same. They competed by simply saying, I can do better than you can do every year. And so there was no institutional framework, no basis for fiscal discipline. And that's what has landed us where we are today.